Making funny faces. Very funny. Is the camera going boom at me? I really should put the camera not on my wobbly laptop screen. Can't hear it, but my cat's. You want on camera, kitty? You're a little cutie. Let's see. Can we both do an ugly face? Hey. Hi, kitty. Oh, he wants down. Hi, kitty. He's probably gonna go meow at me again. Well, I've come to discuss my stream schedule because I think I have something in mind. Now, if you want to keep up on the latest streams, follow me at Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at, I know how to say it, on Twitter at Coldstone Tweets. That's me. Coldstone Tweets. I would have taken Coldstone Tweetery, but that was too many words, too many characters. I know I'm not talking to anybody live right now, but all my YouTube videos get millions of views, so definitely check out the Twitter. I tell you when I didn't tell you this stream. I didn't type about this stream here now, did I? No, did I? I'm not perfect at it. I'll get better. I tell you what. Now, true fans are probably wondering, and it's probably pointless to explain. Well, I'll just put it all on Twitter later, and then I'll explain it now for sake of it. Then put it on the Twitter so that I can just say to people when they inevitably come into this stream and ask me, "Well, what about sewing? What about the sewing stream?" Well, I've decided on a somewhat of a stream schedule here. My goal is 2 to 3 streams a week. Monday, pretty well set on Monday. And then probably Tuesday, but it might have to be Wednesday some weeks. So between Tuesday and Wednesday. Friday's a toss up. Never Thursday. Friday's a toss up. I don't want to have a consistent promise of Friday streams because then my Fridays are shot. So no consistent Friday streams, but Friday sometimes I might do a surprise stream every once in a while on a Friday if I'm feeling like it. And then on the weekends, that's when I do the Let's Learn streams where I sit down and I try to learn something on stream and hopefully people can follow along and share their knowledge and learn as well, learn with me. So look forward to either Saturday or Sunday. You see, one of those two, probably Saturday. One of those two. Look forward to the sewing stream where I learn how to sew a button onto a shirt. That's my stream schedule. Monday streams, Tuesday streams, or Monday or Tuesdays. Monday, listen to me. Let me get this straight. Monday streams, Tuesday or Wednesday. One of those two. Never Thursday. Maybe I'll throw in a Friday. If you're good, I might throw in a Friday. But no promises on Friday, because who knows? I might be, up there knocking boots with the chicky pies. Knocking 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 nine. And then on Saturday or Sunday, I'll have a Let's Learn stream where I try to learn something new. And it won't be the regular reading streams. Sometimes I'm sure it'll be a regular reading stream, but that's when the Let's Learn streams will be. And viewer number one, viewer first guy who just jumped in here, you just missed my whole explanation. So uh, go to that twitter.com/Coldstone Tweets for the explanation of my stream schedule. Not right now, but later, because I'm not going to type it up right now. Understand? Well, welcome to the one streamer, one viewer here. Welcome. Today, as it is a weekday, like I just explained, your people shall be my people, and your God my God. That's Ruth 116. It's a weekday, so we're going to be reading. And I'm jumping back into Sense and Sensibility here because I want to get through it. Not that I'm in a rush, but there's 140 pages left about. And for some reason I said, oh yeah, I'll read this before the new year. And now it's the 10th, and I'm getting just now reading it again. So far, I really like Sense and Sensibility. I read Pride and Prejudice for school, for college, and I thought it was fine. But I didn't like. I don't like anything that somebody tells me. I don't know. I have to choose to read something to enjoy it. I didn't give it a proper shot. Really, I need to read it again. I'm very ignorant at Jane Austen. Sense and Sensibility, though, is very fun. I completely get it. I don't think I fully grasped Pride and Prejudice the first time I read it. I don't think I really gave it a very proper due. This one I'm giving its proper due and quite enjoying because it is very funny and the characters are entertaining and oh yeah, so far it's pretty much just entertaining. I don't know if I like it. I don't know why I like things. I just like things. Let me clear my throat here by muting so I don't disgust you, Mr. Boost, Gangles, whoever you want. Okay, unmuted, and I'm back on the screen. you couldn't see any of that. You couldn't see my face doing that. Wait, you could. Wait, you could. All right, I'm sorry. Let's just get into this. Let's get this over with. I'm so sick of you not saying anything to me. I'm so sick of you watching me. Who do you think you are? Sorry. Freaking out here. I'm sorry. Let's just read some here. I wasted 10 minutes. That's all I got to do at the beginning of these streams, just waste 10 minutes. Why don't I? I really do have to go back through and timestamp some of my old streams so people can skip this, you know, garbage at the beginning. Chapter 35. What happened last time? Well, oh yeah. They went and met Mrs. Ferrers. What was she like? She was not nice. She was not nice at all. I remember. They're at a party. Mrs. Ferrers is there. It might even be at her house. I can't remember. Everybody's there. Colonel Brandon, Mrs. Jennings, girls, obviously. Believe pretty much everybody. The Ferrers is there. The Ferrers is, um, as well as the what were the cousins called? There's the Middletons, and then there's the Middletons like cousins or whatever. They're other cousins. We're getting married to Ferrers. Well, they're also there. So everybody's there, and they're all hanging out. That's pretty much all that happens in these stories. Is that some people are there and then they're not. That's okay. That's life, really. Chapter 35. We'll piece together again what happened. Eleanor's curiosity to see Mrs. Ferrers was satisfied. She had found in her everything that could tend to make a further connection between the families undesirable. She had seen enough of her pride. Oh, pardon me. Oh, my goodness. Oh. Blah. She had seen enough of her pride, her meanness, and her determined prejudice against herself to comprehend all the difficulties that must have perplexed the engagement and retarded the marriage of Edward and herself. Had he been otherwise free, and she had seen almost enough to be thankful for her own sake that one greater obstacle preserved her from suffering under any other of Mrs. Ferris's creations, preserved her from all dependence upon her caprice or any solicitude for her good opinion. Or at least, if she did not bring herself quite to rejoice in Edward's being fettered to Lucy, she determined that had Lucy been more amiable, she ought to have rejoiced. She wondered that Lucy's spirits could be so very much elevated by the civility of Mrs. Ferris, that her interest and her vanity should so very much blind her as to make the attention which seemed only paid her because she was not Eleanor appear a compliment to herself, or to allow her to derive encouragement from a preference only given her because her real situation was unknown. But that it so had not only been declared by Lucy's eyes at the time, but was declared over again the next morning more openly, for at her particular desire, Lady Middleton set her down in Berkeley Street on the chance of seeing Eleanor alone to tell her how happy she was. The chance proved a lucky one, for a message from Mrs. Palmer soon after she arrived carried Mrs. Jennings away. "My dear friend," cried Lucy, as soon as they were by themselves, "I come to talk of you of my happiness. Could anything be so flattering as Mrs. Ferris's way of treating me yesterday? So exceedingly affable as she was, you know how I dreaded the thought of seeing her, but the very moment I was introduced, there was such an affability in her behaviour as really should seem to say she had quite took a fancy to me. Now was it not so? You saw it all, and was not you quite struck with it?" How struck was she? Let me look back and remind myself how civil she was. Let's see, Mrs. Ferrers got in a little spat with Mary Ann, best girl, I remember, but I don't remember her talking to Lucy at all. Let me look back at this. Very pretty. I did not seem to be impressed by the Miss Dashwoods. Um, they are very pretty. In Miss Morton's style painting. That's when they're passing over the paintings. Pity me, Miss Dashwood. Well, I don't mean to waste too much time on recap here. Just trying to remind myself. It has been a couple of weeks now since I've read this. Um, she was barely introduced at all. She was barely in here. Um, I lost the page where I was on. This is not good. 35. Oh, wait. No, I didn't. I was here. I was on. Okay, well, whatever. She was nice to Lucy and mean to the Dashwoods. That's all I remember. She was certainly very civil to you. Hello, Mr. Beast. Civil? Did you see nothing but only civility? I saw a vast deal more. Such kindness as fell to the share of nobody but me. No pride, no hauteur, and your sister just the same, all sweetness and affability. Eleanor wished to talk of something else, but Lucy still pressed to her own that she had reason for her happiness, and Eleanor was obliged to go on. Undoubtedly, if they had known your engagement, said she, nothing could be more flattering than their treatment of you. But as that was not the case, I guessed you would say so, replied Lucy quickly. There was no reason in the world why Mrs. Ferris should seem to like me if she did not, and her liking me is everything. You shan't talk me out of my satisfaction. I am sure it will all end well, and there will be no difficulties at all to what I used to think. Mrs. Ferris is a charming woman, and so is your sister. They got in a big fight. They are both delightful women indeed. I wonder I should never hear you say how agreeable Miss Dashwood was. This Eleanor had no answer to make, and did not attempt any. Are you ill, Miss Dashwood? You seem low. You don't speak. Sure you aren't well? I never was in better health. I am glad of it, with all my heart. But really, you do not look it. I should be so sorry to have you ill, you that have been the greatest comfort to me in the world. Heaven knows what I should have done without your friendship. Eleanor tried to make a civil answer, though doubting her own success, but it seemed to satisfy Lucy, for she directly replied, Indeed, I am perfectly convinced of your regard for me, and next to Edward's love, it is the greatest comfort I have. Poor Edward! But now there is one good thing. We shall be able to meet, and meet pretty often, for Lady Middleton's delighted with Mrs. Dashwood. So we shall be a good deal in Harley Street, I dare say, and Edward spends half his time with his sister. Besides, Lady Middleton and Mrs. Ferris will visit now, and Mrs. Ferris and your sister were both so good to say, more than once, they should always be glad to see me. They are such charming women. I am sure if ever you tell your sister what I think of her, you cannot speak too high. But Eleanor would not give her any encouragement to hope that she should tell her sister. Lucy continued. I am sure I should have seen it in a moment if Mrs. Ferris had took a dislike to me. If she had only made me a formal curtsy, for instance, without saying a word, and never after had took any notice of me, and never looked at me in a pleasant way, you know what I mean. If I had been treated in that forbidding sort of way, then I should have gave it all up in despair. I could not have stood it, for where she does dislike, I know it is most violent. Eleanor was prevented from making any reply to this civil triumph by the doors being thrown open. the servants announcing Mr. Ferrars and Edwards immediately walking in. It was a very awkward moment, and the countenance of each showed that it was so. They all looked exceedingly foolish, and Edward seemed to have as great an inclination to walk out of the room again as to advance further into it. It's funny. It's the same joke that, like, you could see that joke in anything now. It's been done a million times. It's The Simpsons. It's uh, Abe walks in the brothel and he walks right back out again. It's the same joke that's made a million times. It's just funny to hear it in this language. I'm sure it was made before Jane Austen. I'm sure she didn't make up the joke of somebody walks in the room and immediately walks out. The very circumstance in its unpleasantest form, which they would each have been most anxious to avoid, had fallen on them. They were not only all three together, but were together without the relief of any other person. The ladies recovered themselves first. It was not only Lucy's business to put herself forward, and the appearance of secrecy must still be kept up. She could therefore only look her tenderness, and after slightly addressing him, said no more. But Eleanor had more to do, and so anxious was she, for his sake and her own, to do it well that she forced herself, after a moment's recollection, to welcome him, with a look and manner that were almost easy and almost open, and another struggle, another effort still improved them. She would not allow the presence of Lucy, nor the consciousness of some injustice towards herself, to deter her from saying that she was happy to see him, and that she had very much regretted being from home. Jeez. That she had very much regretted being from home when he called before in Berkeley Street. She would not be frightened from paying him those attentions which, as a friend and almost a relation, were his due, by the observant eyes of Lucy, though she soon perceived them to be narrowly watching her. Her manners gave some reassurance to Edward, and he had courage enough to sit down, but his embarrassment still exceeded that of the ladies in a proportion which the case rendered reasonable through his sex. Wait, sorry. And he had courage enough to sit down, but his embarrassment still exceeded that of the ladies in a proportion which the case rendered reasonable through his sex might make it rare. For his heart had not the indifference of Lucy's, nor could his conscience have quite the ease of Eleanor's. Lucy, with a demure and settled air, seemed determined to make no contribution to the comfort of the others, and would not say a word. But almost everything was said proceeded from Eleanor, who was obliged to volunteer all the information about her mother's health, their coming to town, etc., which Edward ought to have inquired about but never did. Her exertions did not stop here, for she soon afterwards felt herself so heroically disposed as to determine, under pretence of fetching Marianne, to leave the others by themselves, and she really did it, and that in the handsomest manner, for she loitered away several minutes on the landing place with the most high minded fortitude before she went to her sister. When that was once done, however, it was time for the raptures of Edward to cease, for Marianne's joy hurried her into the drawing room immediately. Her pleasure in seeing him was like every other of her feelings, strong in itself and strongly spoken. She met him with a hand that would be taken and a voice that expressed the affection of a sister. "Dear Edward," she cried, "this is a moment of great happiness. This would almost make amends for everything." Edward tried to return her kindness as it deserved, but before such witnesses he dared not say half what he really felt. Again they all sat down, and for a moment or two all were silent, while Mary Ann was looking with the most speaking tenderness, sometimes at Edward and sometimes at Eleanor, regretting only that their delight in each other should be checked by Lucy's unwelcome presence. Edward was the first to speak, and was to notice Mary Ann's altered looks and express his fear of her not finding London agree with her. "Oh, don't think of me," she replied with spirited earnestness, though her eyes were filled with tears as she spoke. "Don't think of my health. Eleanor is well, you see. That must be enough for both of us, for us both." This remark was not calculated to make Edward or Eleanor more easy, nor to conciliate the goodwill of Lucy, who looked up at Mary Ann with no very benignant expression. "Do you like London?" said Edward, willing to say anything that might introduce another subject. "Not at all. I expect much pleasure in it, but I have found none. The sight of you, Edward, is the only comfort it has afforded, and thank heaven, you are what you always were." She paused. No one spoke. I love this. "I think, Eleanor," she presently added, "we must employ Edward to take care of us in our return to Barton. In a week or two, I suppose, we shall be going, and I trust Edward will not be very unwilling to accept the charge." Poor Edward muttered something, but what it was nobody knew, not even himself. But Marianne, who saw his agitation and could easily trace it to whatever cause best pleased herself, not perfectly satisfied, and soon talked of something else. "We spent such a day, Edward, in Harley Street yesterday. So dull, so wretchedly dull. But I have much to say to you on the head, which cannot be said now." Head he. And with this admirable dissertion did she defer the assurance of finding their mutual relatives more disagreeable than ever, and of her being particularly disgusted with his mother, till they were more in private. "But why were you not there, Edward? Why did you not come?" "I was engaged elsewhere." "Engaged! But what was that when such friends were to be met?" "Perhaps, Marianne, perhaps Miss Marianne," cried Lucy, eager to take some revenge on her, "you think young men never stand upon engagements, if they have no mind to keep them, little as well as great." Eleanor was very angry, but Marianne seemed entirely insensible of the sting, for she calmly replied, "Not so, indeed, for, seriously speaking, I am very sure that conscience only kept Edward from Harley Street, and I really believe he has the most delicate conscience in the world, the most scrupulous in performing every engagement, however minute, and however it may make against his interest or pleasure. He is the most fearful of giving pain, of wounding expectation, and the most incapable of being selfish of anybody I ever saw. Edward, it is so, and I will say it. What? Are you never to hear yourself praised? Then you must be no friend of mine, for those who will accept of my love and esteem must submit to my open commendation. I love Marianne so much. She's so smoothly took that jab in stride and turned it around. The nature of commendation in the present case, however, happened to be particularly ill suited to the feelings of two-thirds of her auditors, and was so very unexhilarating to Edward that he very soon got up to go away. Going so soon, said Marianne. My dear Edward, this must not be. And drawing him a little aside, she whispered her persuasion that Lucy could not stay much longer. But even this encouragement failed, for he would go, and Lucy, who would have outstayed him had his visit lasted 2 hours, soon afterwards went away. What can bring her here so often? Said Marianne on her leaving them. Could she not see that we wanted her gone? How teasing to Edward! Why so? We were all his friends, and Lucy has been the longest known to him of any. It is but natural that he should like to see her as well as ourselves. Marianne looked at her steadily and said, You know, Eleanor, that this is a kind of talking which I cannot bear. If you only hope to have your assertion contradicted, as I must suppose to be the case, you ought to recollect that I am the last person in the world to do it. I could not descend to be tricked out of the assurances that are not really wanted. She then left the room, and Eleanor dared not follow her to say more, for bound as she was by her promise of secrecy to Lucy, she could give no information that would convince Marianne, and painful as the consequences of her still continuing in an error might be, she was obliged to submit to it. All that she could hope was that Edward would not often expose her or himself to the distress of hearing Marianne's mistaken warmth, nor to the repetition of any other part of the pain that had attended their recent meeting, and this she had every reason to expect. Uh-oh. We're just going to avoid the house now. Poor Eleanor. Doesn't get her man. 35. 36. Can't even read a number. Can't even look down at the number 5. That's the number 6. Can't even look down at the number 6 and see the number 6 when I say chapter 36. I messed up that. I messed up. That's a number, the number 36. Within a few days after this meeting, the newspapers announced to the world that the lady of Thomas Palmer, Esquire, was safely delivered of a son and heir. A very interesting and satisfactory paragraph, at least to all those intimate connections who knew it before. This event, highly important to Mrs. Jennings' happiness, produced a temporary alteration in the disposal of her time, and influenced in a like degree the engagements of her young friends. For as she wished to be as much as possible with Charlotte, she went thither every morning as soon as she was dressed, and did not return till late in the evening, and the Miss Dashwoods, at the particular request of the Middletons, spent the whole of every day in Conduit Street. For their own comfort, they would much rather have remained at least all the morning in Mrs. Jennings' house, but it was not a thing to be urged against the wishes of everybody. Their hours were therefore made over to Lady Middleton and the two Miss Steeles, by whom their company was in fact as little valued as it was professedly sought. They had too much sense to be desirable companions to the former, and by the latter they were considered with a jealous eye, as intruding on their ground and sharing the kindness which they wanted to monopolize. Though nothing could be more polite than Lady Middleton's behavior to Eleanor and Marianne, she did not really like them at all. Just coming right out and saying it. Because they neither flattered herself nor her children, she could not believe them good natured, and because they were fond of reading, she fancied them satirical, perhaps without exactly knowing what it was be satirical. But that did not signify. It was censure in common use, and easily given. Their presence was a restraint both on her and on Lucy. It checked the idleness of one and the business of the other. Lady Middleton was ashamed of doing nothing before them, and the flattery which Lucy was proud to think of, and administer at other times, she feared they would despise her for offering. Miss Steele was the least discomposed of the three by their presence, and it was in their power to reconcile her to it entirely. Would either of them only have given her a full and minute account of the whole affair between Marianne and Mr. Willoughby, she would have thought herself amply rewarded for the sacrifice of the best place by the fire after dinner, which their arrival occasioned. But this conciliation was not granted, for though she often threw out expressions of pity for her sister to Eleanor, and more than once dropped a reflection on the inconsistency of Beau before Marianne, no effect was produced but a look of indifference from the former or of disgust in the latter. An effort even yet lighter might have made her their friend, would they only have laughed at her about the doctor. But so little were they, any more than the others, inclined to oblige her, that if Sir John dined from home, she might spend a whole day without hearing any other raillery on the subject than what she was kind enough to bestow on herself. Hey, Dangles. Welcome to the stream, Dangles. Dr. Dangles. I like that everybody has their title in their name. We got Dr. Dangles and Mr. Beast. Wrong your Dangles. Come on. I don't know why I'm always so mean to Dangles. You don't deserve it. But since this is an educational stream, here you go, Dr. Dangles. Here's a little education that you didn't ask for. The your that you used is the possessive your. If it was your funny, then say this is a funny. It belongs to me, or it belongs to you. It will be your funny. Since it belongs to me, it's my funny. The your you were trying to use is you apostrophe re, uh, which can be lengthened into you are, your, you are. It's a contraction of you and are. Where was I? All these. All right, Dangles. I'll spell it out for you. I'll spell it out for you, Dangles. And for anybody else. Your is possessive. You're funny. Your. If it was your funny, you would be saying to somebody that they have a funny, which you're funny, possessive. The funny belongs to you. That is your funny. You are funny is this. Your. You are. And this doesn't really matter. I'm just doing this for the sake of explaining something educational. Don't do this if you're having a regular conversation with somebody. What I'm doing right now, it would be extremely rude. But since this is a stream where I teach people things, might as well just teach it for fun. You are, you're, you're funny. You are funny. You're. You already knew that. Everybody already knows that when they use the wrong your. And there's another your too. Days of yore. Yeah, I know you know, Dr. Dangles. Everybody knows the yours. I'm just doing it for something, just to break it up. There's another yore too. Days of yore. Like, I don't know what it means. Let's find out exactly the dictionary definition. Long bygone. No, I learned something. Okay. Well, that's the point. Is we're always learning things. The your yore, you would say days of yore, referring to days long past. Let's see. Your means of long ago or former times. So yeah, exactly what I said. Um, Used in nostalgic or mock nostalgic recollection. So I think those are the only three words your that I know of. Your. Yeah. So in days of in days of you're taking your ashore. All these jealousies and discontents, however, were so totally unsuspected by Mrs. Jennings that she thought it a delightful thing for the girls to be together, and generally congratulated her young friends every night on having escaped the company of a stupid old woman so long. She joined them sometimes at Sir John's and sometimes at her own house, but wherever it was, she always came in excellent spirits, full of delight and importance, attributing Charlotte's well doing to her own care, and ready to give so exact, so minute a detail of her situation as only Miss Steele had curiosity enough to desire. Everybody looks down at Miss Jennings on this, but she's got the best attitude. I mean, yeah, she's a gossip, but at least she's a nice gossip. Uh, One thing did disturb her, and of that she made her daily complaint. Mr. Palmer maintained the common but unfatherly opinion among his sex of all infants being alike. And though she could plainly perceive at different times the most striking resemblance between this baby and every one of his relations on both sides, there was no convincing his father of it, no persuading him to believe that it was not exactly like every other baby of the same age, nor could he even be brought to acknowledge the simple proportion of its being the finest child in the world. I come now to the relation of a misfortune which about this time befell Mrs. John Dashwood. It so happened that while her two sisters, with Mrs. Jennings, were first calling on her in Harley Street, another of her acquaintance had dropped in, a circumstance in itself not apparently likely to produce evil to her. But while the imaginations of other people will carry them away to form wrong judgments of our conduct and to decide on it by the slightest appearances, one's happiness must in some measure be always at the mercy of chance. In the present instance, this last arrived lady allowed her fancy so far to outrun truth and probability that on merely hearing the name of the Miss Dashwoods and understanding them to be Mr. Dashwood's sisters, she immediately concluded them to be staying in Harley Street. and this misconstruction produced within a day or two afterwards cards of invitation for them, as well as for their brother and sister, to a small musical party at her house. The consequence of which was that Mrs. John Dashwood was obliged to submit not only to the exceedingly great inconvenience of sending her carriage for the Miss Dashwoods, but, what was still worse, must be subject to all the unpleasantness of appearing to treat them with attention. And who could tell that they might not expect to go out with her a second time? The power of disappointing them, it was true, must always be hers, but that was not enough, for when people are determined on a mode of conduct which they know to be wrong, they feel injured by the expectation of anything better from them. This is John Dashwood. What a woman. Marianne had now been brought by degrees so much into the habit of going out every day that it was become a matter of indifference to her whether she went out or not, and she prepared quietly and mechanically for every evening's engagement, though without expecting the smallest amusement from any, and very often without knowing till the last moment where it was to take her. To her dress and appearance she was grown so perfectly indifferent as not to bestow half the consideration on it, during the whole of her toilette, which it received from Miss Steele in the first 5 minutes of their being together, when it was finished. Nothing escaped her minute observation and general curiosity. She saw everything and asked everything, was never easy till she knew the price of every part of Marianne's dress, could have guessed the number of her gowns altogether with better judgment than Marianne herself, and was not without hopes of finding out before they parted how much her washing cost per week, and how much she had every year to spend upon herself. The impertinence of these kind of scrutinies, moreover, was generally concluded with a compliment, which, though meant as its dossier, was considered by Marianne as the greatest impertinence of all, for after undergoing an examination into the value and make of her gown, the color of her shoes, and the arrangement of her hair, she was almost sure of being told that upon her word she looked vastly smart, and she dared to say would make many great conquests. With such encouragement as this was she dismissed on the present occasion to her brother's carriage, which they were ready to enter 5 minutes after it stopped at the door, a punctuality not very agreeable to their sister-in-law, who had preceded them to the house of her acquaintance, and was there hoping for some delay on their part that might inconvenience either herself or her coachman. The events of the evening were not very remarkable. The party, like other musical parties, comprehended a great many people who had real taste for the performance, and a great many more who had none at all. And the performers themselves were, as usual, in their own estimations and that of their immediate friends, the first private performers in England. As Eleanor was neither musical nor affecting to be so, she made no scruple of turning away her ears from the grand pianoforte whenever it suited her, and, unrestrained even by the presence of a harp or a violoncello, would fix them at pleasure on any other object in the room. In one of these excursive glances she perceived among a group of young men the very he who had given them a lecture on toothpick cases at Gray's. She perceived him soon afterwards looking at herself and speaking familiarly to her brother, and had just determined to find out his name from the latter when they both came toward her, and Mr. Dashwood introduced him to her as Mr. Robert Ferrars. He addressed her with an easy civility, and twisted his head into a bow which asserted her as plainly as words could have done that he was exactly the coxcomb she had heard him described to be by Lucy. Happy had it been for her if her regard for Edward had depended less on his own merit than on the merit of his nearest relations, for then this brother's bow must have given the finishing stroke to what the ill humor of his mother and sister would have begun. But while she wondered at the difference of the two young men, she did not find that the emptiness and conceit of the one put her at all out of charity with the modesty and worth of the other. Why, they were different, Robert explained to her himself, in the course of a quarter of an hour's conversation, for talking of his brother and lamenting the extreme gaucherie which with which he really believed him from mixing goodness gracious, from which he really believed kept him from mixing in proper society, he candidly and generously attributed it much less to any natural deficiency than to the misfortune of a private education, while he himself, though probably without any material superiority by nature, merely from the advantage of a public school, was as well fitted to mix in the world as any other man. Upon my soul, he added, I believe it is nothing more, and so I often tell my mother when she is grieving about it. My dear madam, I always say to her, you must make yourself easy. The evil is now irredeemable, and it has been entirely your own doing. Why would you be persuaded by my uncle, Sir Robert, against your own judgment, to place Edward under private tuition at the most critical time of his life? If you had only sent him to Westminster, as well as myself, instead of sending him to Mr. Pratt's, all this would have been prevented. This is the way in which I always considered the matter, and my mother is perfectly convinced of her error. Eleanor would not oppose his opinion, because, whatever might be her general estimation of the advantage of a public school, she could not think of Edward's abode in Mr. Pratt's family with any satisfaction. You reside in Devonshire, I think. Oh, wait. You reside in Devonshire, I think, was his next observation. In a cottage near Dawlish. Eleanor set him right as to its situation, and it seemed rather surprising to him that anybody could live in Devonshire without living near Dawlish. He bestowed his hearty approbation, however, on their species of house. For my own part, said he, I am exceedingly fond of a cottage. There is always so much comfort, so much elegance about them, and I protest, if I had any money to spare, I should buy a little land and build one myself, with a short distance of London, where I might drive myself down at any time and collect a few friends about me and be happy. I advise everybody who is going to build a cottage. My friend Lord Courtland came to me the other day on purpose to ask my advice, and laid before me 3 different plans of Bonomi's. I was to decide on the best of them. My dear Courtland, said I, immediately throwing them all into the fire, do not adopt either of them, but by all means build a cottage, and that, I fancy, will be the end of it. Some people imagine that there can be no accommodations, no space in a cottage, but this is all a mistake. I was last month at my dear friend at my friend Elliot's near Dartford. Lady Elliot wished to give a dance. But how can it be done? Said she. My dear Ferrers, do tell me how it is to be managed. There is not a room in this cottage that will hold 10 couples, and where can the supper be? I immediately saw that there could be no difficulty in it. So I said, My dear Lady Elliot, do not be uneasy. The dining parlor will admit 18 couples with ease. Card tables may be placed in the dining room. The library may be open for tea and other refreshments, and let the supper be set out in the saloon. Lady Elliot was delighted with the thought. We measured the dining room and found it would hold exactly 18 couples, and the affair was arranged precisely after my plan. So that, in fact, you see, if people do but know how to set about it, every comfort may be as well enjoyed in a cottage as in the most spacious dwelling. Eleanor agreed to it all, for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. As John Dashwood had no more pleasure in music than his eldest sister, his mind was equally at liberty to fix on anything else, and a thought struck him during the evening, which he communicated to his wife for her approbation when they got home. The consideration of Mrs. Dennison's mistake in supposing her sisters their guests had suggested the propriety of their being really invited to become such, while Mrs. Jennings' engagements kept her from home. The expense would be nothing, the inconvenience not more, and it was altogether an attention which the delicacy of his conscience pointed out to be requisite in its complete enfranchisement from his promise to his father. Fanny was startled at the proposal. I do not see how it can be done, said she, without affronting Lady Middleton, for they spend every day with her. Otherwise, I should be exceedingly glad to do it. You know I am always ready to pay them any attention in my power, as my taking them out this evening shows. But they are Lady Middleton's visitors. How can I ask them away from her? Her husband, with great humility, her husband, but with great humility, did not see force of her objection. They had already spent a week in this manner in Conduit Street, and Lady Middleton could not be displeased at their giving the same number of days to such near relations. Fanny paused a moment, and then with fresh vigor said, My, I love this. These two have such a funny little interaction. They did the same thing at the beginning about the money, but now she just does. She comes up with any excuse to not be nice to these sisters. I really got to blow my nose. Give me a second here. Kind of gross. Okay. My love, I would ask them with all my heart if it was in my power. But I had just settled within myself to ask the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. They are very well behaved, good kind of girls, and I think the attention is due to them, as their uncle did so very well by Edward. We can ask your sisters some other year, you know. The Miss Steeles may not be in town any more. I am sure you will like them. Indeed, you do like them, you know, very much already. And so does my mother. And they are such favorites with Harry. Mr. Dashwood was convinced. He saw the necessity of inviting the Miss Steeles immediately, and his conscience was pacified by the resolution of inviting his sisters another year. At the same time, however, slyly suspecting that another year would make the invitation needless by bringing Eleanor to town as Colonel Brandon's wife and Marianne as their visitor. Fanny, rejoicing in her escape and proud of the ready wit that had procured it, wrote the next morning to Lucy to request her company and her sister's for some days in Harley Street, as soon as Lady Middleton could spare them. This was enough to make Lucy really and reasonably happy. Mrs. Dashwood seemed actually working for her, herself cherishing all her hopes and promoting all her views. Such an opportunity of being with Edward and his family was, above all things, the most material to her interest, and such an invitation the most gratifying to her feelings. It was an advantage that could not be too gratefully acknowledged, nor too speedily made use of, and the visit to Lady Middleton, which had not before had any precise limits, was instantly discovered to have been always meant to end in 2 days' time. When the note was shown to Eleanor, as it was within 10 minutes after its arrival, it gave her for the first time some share in the expectations of Lucy, for such a mark of uncommon kindness, vouchsafed on so short an acquaintance, seemed to declare that the good will towards her arose from something more than merely malice against herself, and might be brought by time to address to do everything that Lucy wished. Her flattery had already subdued the pride of Lady Middleton, and made an entry into the close heart of Mrs. John Dashwood, and these were effects that laid upon the probability of greater. The Miss Steeles removed to Harley Street, and all that reached Eleanor of their influence there strengthened her expectation of the event. Sir John, who called on them more than once, brought home such accounts of the favor they were in as much being universally striking as must be universally striking. Mrs. Dashwood had never been so much pleased with any young woman in her life as she was with them, had given each of them a needle book made by some emigrant, called Lucy by her Christian name, and did not know whether she should ever be able to part with them. I love that Eleanor's like, well, they must like her a lot. It can't just be that they don't like me, when it actually is that she just doesn't like her. Chapter 37. Mrs. Palmer was so well at the end of a fortnight that her mother felt it no longer necessary to give up the whole of her time to her, and contenting herself with visiting her once or twice a day, returned from that period to her own home and her own habits, in which she found the Miss Dashwoods very ready to reassume their former share. About the third or fourth morning after their being thus resettled into Berkeley Street, Mrs. Jennings, on returning from her ordinary visit to Mrs. Palmer, entered the drawing room, where Eleanor was sitting by herself, with an air of such hurrying importance as prepared her to hear something wonderful, and giving her time only to form that idea, being directly to justify it by saying, "Lord, my dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard the news?" "No, ma'am. What is it?" "Something so strange. But you shall hear it all. When I got to Mr. Palmer's, I found Charlotte quite in a fuss about the child. She was sure it was very ill. It cried and fretted and was all over pimples. So I looked at it directly, and, 'Lord, my dear,' says I, 'it is nothing in the world but the red gum.' and the nurse said just the same. But Charlotte, she would not be satisfied, so Mr. Donovan was sent for, and luckily he happened to be just come in from Harley Street, so he stepped over directly, and as soon as ever he saw the child, he said, just as we did, that it was nothing in the world but the red gum, and then Charlotte was easy. And so, just as he was going away again, it came into my head, I am sure I do not know how I happened to think of it, but it came into my head to ask him if there was any news. So, yeah, it came into your head to ask if there's any news. The biggest gossip in the story. Very funny. Very, very funny. So upon that he smirked and simpered and looked grave and seemed to know something or other. And at last he said in a whisper, for fear any unpleasant report should reach the young ladies under your care as to their sister's indisposition, I think it advisable to say that I believe there is no great reason for alarm. I hope Mrs. Dashwood will do very well. What? Is Fanny ill? That is exactly what I said, my dear. Lord, says I, is Mrs. Dashwood ill? So then it all came out, and the long and the short of the matter, by all I can learn, seems to be this. Mr. Edward Ferrars, the very young man I used to joke with you about. But, however, as it turns out, I am monstrous glad there never was anything in it. Mr. Edward Ferrars, it seems, has been engaged above this 12-month to my cousin Lucy. There's for you, my dear, and not a creature knowing a syllable of the matter except Nancy. Could you have believed such a thing possible? There's no great wonder in their liking one another, but that matters should be brought so forward between them, and nobody suspect it, that is strange. I never happened to see them together, or I am sure I should have found it out directly. Well, and so this was kept a great secret for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, and neither she nor your brother or sister suspected a word of the matter till this very morning. Poor Nancy, who you know is a very well-meaning creature, but no conjurer, popped it all out. Lord, thinks she to herself, they are all so fond of Lucy, to be sure they will make no difficulty about it. And so away she went to your sister, who was sitting all alone at her carpet work, little suspecting what was about to come. But she had just been saying to your brother only 5 minutes before that she thought to make a match between Edward and some lord's daughter or other, I forgot who. So you may think it what a blow it was to all her vanity and pride. She fell into violent hysterics immediately, with such screams as reached your brother's ears, as he was sitting in his own dressing room downstairs, thinking about writing a letter to his steward in the country. So up he flew directly, and a terrible scene took place, for Lucy was come to them by that time, little dreaming what was going on. Poor soul! I pity her, and I must say I think she was used very hardly, for your sister scolded like any fury, and soon drove her into a fainting fit. Nancy, she fell upon her knees and cried bitterly, and your brother, he walked about the room and said he did not know what to do. Mrs. Dashwood declared that they should not stay a minute longer in the house, and your brother was forced to go down upon his knees, too, to persuade her to let them stay till they had packed up their clothes. Then she fell into hysterics again, and he was so frightened that he would send for Mr. Donovan, and Mr. Donovan found the house in all this uproar. The carriage was at the door ready to make my wait. The carriage was at the door ready to take my poor cousins away, and then they were just stepping in as he came off. Poor Lucy, in such a condition, he says, she could hardly walk, and Nancy, she was almost as bad. I declare I have no patience with your sister, and I hope with all my heart it will be a match in spite of her. Lord, what a taking poor Mr. Edward will be in when he hears of it. To have his love used so scornfully. For they say he is monstrous fond of her, as well he may. I should not wonder if he was to be in the greatest of a passion, and Mr. Donovan thinks just the same. He and I had a great deal of talk about it, and the best of all is that he is gone back again to Harley Street, that he may be within call when Mrs. Ferris is told of it, for she was sent for as soon as ever my cousins left the house, for your sister was sure she would be in hysterics too, and so she may, for what I care. I have no pity for either of them. I have no notion of people's making such a to do about money and greatness. There is no reason on earth why Mr. Edward and Lucy should not marry, for I am sure Mrs. Ferris may afford to do very well by her son, and though Lucy has next to nothing herself, she knows better than anybody how to make the most of everything, and I dare say if Mrs. Ferris would only allow him 500 a year, she would make as good an appearance with it as anybody else would with 8. Lord, how snug they might live in such another cottage as yours, or a little bigger, with 2 maids and 2 men, and I believe I could help them with a housemaid, for my Betty has a sister out of place that would fit them exactly. Here Miss Jennings ceased, and as Eleanor had had time enough to collect her thoughts, she was able to give such an answer and make such observations as the subject might naturally be supposed to produce, happy to find that she was not suspected of any extraordinary interest in it, that Miss Jennings, as she had of late often hoped might be the case, had ceased to imagine her at all attached to Edward, and happy above all that the rest of the absent happy above all the rest in the absence of Marianne. She felt very well able to speak of the affair without embarrassment, and to give her judgment, as she believed, with impartiality, on the conduct of every one concerned in it. She could hardly determine what her own expectation of its event really was, though she earnestly tried to drive away the notion of its being possible to end otherwise at last than in the marriage of Edward and Lucy. What Mrs. Ferrars would say and do, though there could not be a doubt of its nature, she was anxious to hear, and still more anxious to know how Edward would conduct himself. For him she felt much compassion, for Lucy very little, and it cost her some pains to procure that little, for the rest of the party none at all. And Mrs. Jennings could talk on no other subject. Eleanor soon saw the necessity of preparing Mary Ann for its discussion. No time would be lost in undeceiving her, in making her acquainted with the real truth, and in endeavoring to bring her to hear it talked of by others without betraying that she felt any uneasiness for her sister or any resentment against Edward. Eleanor's office was a painful one. She was going to remove what she really believed to be her sister's chief consolation, to give such particulars of Edward as she feared would ruin him forever in her good opinion, and to make Marianne, by a resemblance in their situations, which to her fancy would seem strong, feel all her own disappointment over again. But unwelcome as such a task must be, it was necessary to be done, and Eleanor therefore hastened to perform it. Hey, Tweaker2330. Thanks for the emoji. Welcome to the readery. It just became public that Edward is going to marry Lucy. What a surprise! She was very far from wishing to dwell on her own feelings, or to represent herself as suffering much, any otherwise than as the self command she had practiced since her first knowledge of Edward's engagement might suggest a hint of what was practicable to Marianne. Her narration was clear and simple, and though it could not be given without emotion, it was not accompanied by violent agitation nor impetuous grief. That belonged rather to the hearer, for Marianne listened with horror and cried excessively. Eleanor was to be the comforter of others in her own distress, no less than in theirs, and all the comfort that could be given by assurances of her own composure of mind, and a very earnest vindication of Edward from every charge but of imprudence, was readily offered. But Marianne for some time would give credit to neither. Edward seemed a second Willoughby, and acknowledging, as Eleanor did, that she had loved him most sincerely, could she feel less than herself? As for Lucy Steele, she considered her so totally unamiable, so absolutely incapable of attracting a sensible man, ladies, absolutely incapable of attracting a sensible man, that she could not be persuaded at first to believe, and afterwards to pardon, any former affection of Edward for her. She would not even admit it to have been natural, and Eleanor left her to be convinced that it was so by that which only could convince her a better knowledge of mankind. Let me read that sentence again. That was kind of confusing. She would not even admit it to have been natural, and Eleanor left her to be convinced that it was so by that which could only convince her a better knowledge of mankind. Her first communication had reached no farther than to state the fact of the engagement and the length of time it had existed. Marianne's feelings that had then broken in and put an end to all regularity of detail, and for some time all that could be done was to soothe her distress, lessen her alarms, and combat her resentment. The first question on her side, which led to further particulars, was, "How long has this been known to you, Eleanor? Has he written to you?" "I have known it these 4 months. When Lucy first came to Barton Park last November, she told me in confidence of her engagement." At these words, Marianne's eyes expressed the astonishment which her lips could not utter. After a pause of wonder, she exclaimed, "4 months! Have you known of this 4 months?" Eleanor confirmed it. "What? While attending me in all my misery, has this been on your heart? And I have reproached you for being happy. It was not fit that you should then know how much I was the reverse." "4 months!" cried Marianne again. "So calm, so cheerful. How have you been supported?" "By feeling that I was doing my duty. My promise to Lucy obliged me to be secret. I owed it to her, therefore, to avoid giving any hint of the truth. And I owed it to my family and friends not to create in them a solicitude about me which it could not be in my power to satisfy." Marianne seemed much struck. "I have very often wished to undeceive yourself and my mother," added Eleanor, "and once or twice I have attempted it, but without betraying my trust. I never could have convinced you." "4 months! And yet you loved him?" "Yes, but I did not love only him, and while the comfort of others was dear to me, I was glad to spare them from knowing how much I felt. Now I can think and speak of it with little emotion. I would not have you suffer on my account, for I assure you I no longer suffer materially myself. I have many things to support me. I am not conscious of having provoked the disappointment by any imprudence of my own, and I have borne it as much as possible without spreading it further. I acquit Edward of all essential misconduct. I wish him very happy, and I am so sure of his always doing his duty that though now he may harbor some regret, in the end he must become so. Lucy does not want sense, and that is the foundation on which everything good may be built. And after all, Marianne, after all that is bewitching in the idea of a single and constant attachment, and all that can be said of one's happiness depending entirely on any particular person, it is not meant. It is not fit. It is not possible that it should be so. Edward will marry Lucy. He will marry a woman superior in person and understanding to half her sex, and time and habit will teach him to forget that he ever thought another superior to her. If such is your way of thinking, said Marianne, if the loss of what is most valued is so easily to be made up by something else, your resolution, your self command, are perhaps a little less to be wondered at. They are brought more within my comprehension. I understand you. You do not support that I have ever felt much. For 4 months, Marianne, I have had all this hanging on my mind without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature, knowing that it would make you and my mother most unhappy whenever it were explained to you, yet unable to prepare for you for it in the least. It was told me it was in a manner forced on me by the very person herself whose prior engagement ruined all my prospects, and told me, as I thought, with triumph. This person's suspicions, therefore, I have had to oppose by endeavoring to appear indifferent, where I have been most deeply interested. And it has not been only once I have had her hopes and exultation to listen to again and again. I have known myself to be divided from Edward forever, without hearing one circumstance that could make me less desire the connection. Nothing has proved him unworthy, nor has anything declared him indifferent to me. I have had to contend against the unkindness of his sister and the insolence of his mother, and have suffered the punishment of an attachment without enjoying its advantages. And all this has been going on at a time when, as you too well know, it has not been my only unhappiness. If you can think me capable of ever feeling, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now. The composure of mind with which I have brought myself at present to consider the matter, consultation that I have been willing to admit, have been the effect of constant and painful exertion. They did not spring up of themselves. They did not occur to relieve my spirits at first. No, Marianne. Then, if I had not been bound to silence, perhaps nothing could have kept me entirely, not even what I owed to my dearest friend, from openly showing that I was very unhappy. Marianne was quite subdued. "Oh, Eleanor," she cried, "you have made me hate myself forever. How barbarous I have been to you! You who have been my only comfort, who have borne with me in all my misery, who have seemed to be only suffering for me. Is this my gratitude? Is this the only return I can make you? Because your merit cries out upon myself. I have been trying to do it away." The tenderest caresses followed this confession. In such a frame of mind as she was now in, Eleanor had no difficulty in obtaining from her whatever promise she required, and at her request Marianne engaged never to speak of the affair to anyone with the least appearance of bitterness, to meet Lucy without betraying the smallest increase of dislike to her, and even to see Edward himself, if chance should bring them together, without any diminution of her usual cordiality. These were great concessions, but where Marianne felt that she had injured, no reparation could be made too much for her to make. Could be wait, no reparation could be too much for her to make. She performed her promise of being discreet to admiration. She attended to all that Mrs. Jennings had to say upon the subject with an unchanging complexion, dissented from her in nothing, and was heard 3 times to say, "Yes, ma'am." She listened to her praise of Lucy with only moving from one chair to another, and when Mrs. Jennings talked of Edward's affection, it cost only her a spasm in her throat. Such advances towards heroism in her sister made Eleanor feel equal to anything herself. The next morning brought a further trial of it in a visit from their brother, who came with a most serious aspect to talk over the dreadful affair and bring them news of his wife. "You have heard, I suppose," said he with great solemnity as soon as he was seated, "of the very shocking discovery that took place under our roof yesterday." They all looked their assent. It seemed too awful a moment for speech. "Your sister," he continued, "has suffered dreadfully. Mrs. Ferrars, too. In short, it has been a scene of such complicated distress. But I will hope that the storm may be weathered without our being any of us quite overcome. Poor Fanny! She was in hysterics all yesterday. But I would not alarm you too much. Donovan says there is nothing materially to be apprehended. Her constitution is a good one, and her resolution equal to anything. She has borne it all with the fortitude of an angel. She says she shall never think well of anybody again, and one cannot wonder at it after being so deceived, meeting with such ingratitude where so much kindness had been shown, so much confidence had been placed. It was quite out of the benevolence of her heart that she had asked these young women to her house, merely because she thought they deserved some attention, were harmless, well behaved girls, and would be pleasant companions. For otherwise we both wished very much to have invited you and Marianne to be with us, while your kind friends there was attending her daughter. And now to be so rewarded. "I wish with all my heart," says poor Fanny in her affectionate way, "that we had asked your sisters instead of them." Here he stopped to be thanked, which being done, he went on. "What poor Mrs. Ferrars suffered when first Fanny broke it to her is not to be described. While she was with the truest affection, while she, with the truest affection, had been planning a most eligible connection for him, was it to be supposed that he could be all the time secretly engaged to another person? Such a suspicion could never have entered her head. If she suspected any prepossession elsewhere, it could not be in that quarter. There, to be sure, she said, I might have thought myself safe. She was quite in an agony. We consulted together, however, as to what should be done, and at last she determined to send for Edward. He came, but I am sorry to relate what ensued. All that Mrs. Ferrars could say to make him put an end to the engagement, assisted too, as you may well suppose, by my arguments and Fanny's entreaties, was of no avail. Duty, affection, everything was disregarded. I never thought Edward so stubborn, so unfeeling before. His mother explained to him her liberal designs in case of his marrying, Miss Morton, told him she would settle on him the Norfolk estate, which, clear of land tax, brings in a good 1,000 a year. Offered even, when matters grew desperate, to make it 1,200, and in opposition to this, if he still persisted in this low connection, represented to him the certain penury that must attend the match. His own £2,000, she protested, should be his all. She would never see him again, and so far would she be from affording him the smallest assistance that if he were to enter into any profession with a view of better support, she would do all in her power to prevent his advancing in it. Wow, what a what a good mom. Here Mary Ann, in an ecstasy of indignation, clasped her hands together and cried, "Gracious God, can this be possible?" "Well, may you wonder, Mary Ann," replied her brother, "at the obstinacy which could resist such arguments as these. Your exclamation is very natural." Mary Ann was going to retort, but she remembered her promises and forbore. All this, however, he continued, was urged in vain. Edward said very little, but what he did say was in the most determined manner. Nothing should prevail on him to give up his engagement. He would stand to it, cost him what it might. "Then," cried Mrs. Jennings with blunt sincerity, no longer able to be silent, "he acted like an honest man. I beg your pardon, Mr. Dashwood, but if he had done otherwise, I should have thought him a rascal. I have such little concern in the business, as well as yourself, for Lucy Steele is my cousin, and I believe there is not a better kind of girl in the world, nor one who more deserves a good husband." John Dashwood was greatly astonished, but his nature was calm, not open to provocation, and he never wished to offend anybody, especially anybody of good fortune. He therefore replied without any resentment, "I would by no means speak disrespectfully of any relation of yours, madam. Miss Lucy Steele is, I dare say, a very deserving young woman. But in the present case, you know, the connection must be impossible. And to have entered into a secret engagement with a young man under her uncle's care, the son of a woman especially of such a very large fortune as Mrs. Ferrars, is perhaps altogether a little extraordinary. In short, I do not mean to reflect upon the behavior of any person whom you have a regard for, Miss Jennings. We all wish her extremely happy, and Mrs. Ferris's conduct throughout the whole has been such as every conscientious, good mother in like circumstances would adopt. It has been dignified and liberal. Edward has drawn his own lot, and I fear it will be a bad one." Mary Ann sighed out her similar apprehension, and Eleanor's heart wrung for the feelings of Edward while braving his mother's threats for a woman who could not reward him. "Well, sir," said Mrs. Jennings, "and how did it end?" "Oh, I am sorry to say, ma'am, it is a most unhappy rupture. Edward is dismissed forever from his mother's notice. He left her house yesterday, but where he is gone, or whether he is still in town, I do not know, for we, of course, can make no inquiry." "Poor young man! And what is to become of him?" "What indeed, ma'am? It is a melancholy consideration, born to the prospect of such affluence. I cannot conceive a situation more deplorable. The interest of £2,000, how can a man live on it? And and when to that is added the recollection that he might, but for his own folly, within 3 months have been in the receipt of two 5,000, 2,500 a year, for Miss Morton had £30,000, I cannot picture to myself a more wretched condition. We must all feel for him, and the more so because it is totally out of our power to assist him. Poor young man, cried Mrs. Jennings. I am sure he should be very welcome to bed and board at my house, and so I would tell him if I could see him. It is not fit that he should be living about at his own charge now at lodgings and taverns. Eleanor's heart thanked her for such kindness towards Edward, though she could not forbear smiling at the form of it. If he would have only done as well by himself, said John Dashwood, as all his friends were disposed to do by him, he might now have been in his proper situation, and would have wanted for nothing. But as it is, it must be out of anybody's power to assist him, and there is one thing more preparing against him, which must be worse than all. His mother has determined, with a very natural kind of spirit, to settle that estate upon Robert immediately, which might have been Edward's on proper conditions. I left her this morning with her lawyer, talking over the business. Well, said Mrs. Jennings, that is her revenge. Everybody has a way of their own, but I don't think mine would be to make one son independent because another had plagued me. Marianne got up and walked about the room. Can anything be more galling to the spirit of a man, continued John, than to see his younger brother in possession of an estate which might have been his own? Poor Edward! I feel for him sincerely. A few minutes more spent in the same kind of effusion concluded his visit, and with repeated assurances to his sisters that he really believed there was no material danger in Fanny's indisposition, and that they need not therefore be very uneasy about it, he went away, leaving the three ladies unanimous in their sentiments on the present occasion, as far at least as in regard to Mrs. Ferris's conduct, the Dashwoods and Edwards. Marianne's indignation burst forth as soon as he quitted the room, and her vehemence made reserve impossible in Eleanor and unnecessary in Mrs. Jennings. They all joined in a very spirited critique of the party. Oh me, oh my, oh. Things are getting exciting here. But I think that's where we're going to have to leave it off for the night, as it's getting late. We got to chapter 38 today. Maybe one or two more, well, probably two more sessions of reading this Sense and Sensibility. Of course, the next stream, as I said at the beginning to no one, will be how to sew a button onto a shirt. This weekend. This weekend. But next week, we'll finish Sense and Sensibility, and then we can move on to something new. More stories. I was told that people want more short stories so that we can comment on them as we go along more easily, have more discussion. Of course, I have no problem stopping and discussing in the middle of these long stories, but people don't have the attention span to sit through the whole thing, I suppose. Phantom of the Opera. I'd have to find out which translation of Phantom of the Opera is in the public domain, if one such exists, or else I would just have to translate it from the French myself, which I'm no way able to do. My French is in no way good enough. There's probably a if we can't do that, we can watch one of the public domain movies of Phantom of the Opera. You know what's public domain now is Steamboat Willie. The first Mickey Mouse cartoon. Public domain. Batman will be public domain soon. All these media empires. Perhaps they'll crumble now that the protection of copyright is starting to slip from beneath their feet. I would love to see Disney fail. Whatever you would enjoy reading. I was recommended, or I was requested, some H.G. Wells as well. So perhaps War of the Worlds is coming, or The Time Machine. Something along those lines. We'll see. I want to get Death of Ivan Illich in because it's so short. It's only 100 pages, 99 pages. It's a very sad tale, but I want to do it because I like it. I haven't read it. Oh, I just bumped my mic. I haven't read it since high school. I want to read it again because I love Tolstoy. At some point, I'll read War and Peace too. But that'll probably be like, well, time for today's episode of War and Peace, where I just read one little chapter or something. I don't know if I'll. I don't know. War and Peace can't be ever be the only thing I'm reading because that will take literally years. Um, so it would have to be like a every other Friday I read this many War and Peace chapters. I don't really think I'm just going to read one thing at a time like I have been with Sense and Sensibility here. I think I'll kind of splice it up as this in the streams, and then obviously you can go back on YouTube. All the streams are on YouTube. Um, YouTube.com/Coldstone Readery. You can go back and listen to any of the old streams, including this one. And I have to draw more YouTube thumbnails on Paint. Well, that's enough for tonight. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed the stream. The Sense and Sensibility stream. Good night. Good night.